You sit across from someone you trust. They tell you a story that sounds slightly off, but you push the doubt away because you believe them. Days later, the story changes, then changes again. Each version delivered with the same conviction, the same warmth in their eyes. You're not imagining it. The pieces don't fit, and somewhere in your chest, you feel a knot tighten because you realize they might not even know they're lying. Carl Jung gave years of his life studying people who lived inside invented narratives. He documented cases where individuals performed entire identities during altered states of consciousness, creating elaborate personas that felt real in the moment but dissolved under scrutiny. Modern neuroscience reflects his insights, mapping the brain patterns of people who lie so frequently that dishonesty becomes automatic, effortless, almost reflexive. The prefrontal regions that normally pump the brakes on deception grow quieter. The lie becomes easier than the truth. In today's video, you'll walk away understanding 3 core mechanisms: how lying becomes compulsive through shadow projection and neural habit formation, how it differs from strategic manipulation, and how the false self fragments identity until reality itself becomes negotiable. Stay with me until the end, because I'll give you a practice to begin reclaiming truth when you've been caught in someone else's fiction. Let's start with what happens in the mind and brain when lying stops being a choice. Jung discovered something dangerous in his early clinical work. People arrived at his office with stories that didn't add up, not because they were scheming, but because they were living inside narratives their unconscious mind had written. He called it shadow projection. The parts of yourself you can't accept, the shame, the inadequacy, the rage, they don't disappear. They slip below awareness and keep working in the dark, building stories that let you avoid facing what's actually inside. In one case, Jung observed a woman who entered what he called twilight states, periods where her ordinary sense of self switched off and an entirely different personality chain took over. During these episodes, she performed invented roles with complete conviction, creating memories and motives that vanished when she returned to her normal, waking consciousness. The line between make-believe and reality blurred. She wasn't acting. The act was acting on her. What starts as a deliberate story, a way to escape an uncomfortable truth, hardens into something automatic. Jung noted that ideas can slip below the threshold of awareness and continue incubating unconsciously. Later, they resurface as fully formed reveries that feel compelling, urgent, necessary. The person doesn't experience them as lies. They experience them as truths that finally explain the chaos they feel inside. Modern neuroscience shows us the mechanics happening within the brain. Researchers studying self-serving dishonesty found that when people could freely choose to lie for personal gain, the more dishonest individuals lied faster and showed reduced activity in brain regions tied to control and valuation. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and inferior frontal gyrus, areas that normally inhibit impulses and weigh consequences, grew quieter with repeated dishonesty. At the same time, functional coupling between these control regions and value processing areas increased. The brain wasn't working harder. It was working more efficiently, like muscle memory for deception. Think of it this way. The first time you lie for gain, your brain throws up yellow lights. Anxiety spikes. You hesitate. But if you do it again and again, the neural circuits learn. The prefrontal brakes ease off. The valuation system stops flagging the cost. The lie becomes as easy as breathing. Multivariate patterns in the brain's value regions could even predict how dishonest a person was likely to be, suggesting a trait-like neural signature that tracks individual differences in lying behavior. Jung's phenomenology explains why inner conflicts get acted out as external stories. Neuroscience explains how those stories become automatic. Together, they reveal a compulsive loop where lying grows easier, faster, and more believable to the liar even as it undermines their actual life. The person isn't calculating. They're caught in a circuit that rewards avoidance and punishes facing the shadow material head-on. But how do we tell the difference between this kind of compulsion and someone who's simply manipulating others for gain? Not all lying is pathological. Some people lie strategically, with clear goals and calculated payoffs. They know the truth and choose to obscure it. Pathological lying is different. It's often compulsive, partially unconscious, and serves a protective function rather than an instrumental one. The lies don't always make sense. They don't always benefit the person telling them. They protect against something deeper: shame, inadequacy, conflicted impulses that can't be faced directly. Researchers Curtis and Hart proposed a clinical threshold to distinguish pathological lying from prolific but non-clinical dishonesty. They define it as a persistent, pervasive, often compulsive pattern of excessive lying that causes marked distress, functional impairment, or danger lasting 6 months or more. This reframes pathological lying as a potential syndrome, not just lying a lot. The focus shifts from frequency to harm. People identified with pathological lying report specific patterns: adolescent onset, long duration, often years, and lies that grow from an initial claim, spiraling outward as the person tries to maintain the fiction. Many describe lying for no apparent reason, pointing to an endogenous or protective motive rather than a calculated payoff. The social domain takes the hardest hit. Pathological lies concentrate in face-to-face interactions, often targeting friends and acquaintances where trust is most fragile. The fallout includes loss of credibility, conflict, and isolation, consequences that set pathological lying apart from tactical deception that stays limited and instrumental. Respondents with pathological lying frequently describe an urge-like pressure to lie and relief afterward. It's a negative reinforcement loop. The lie temporarily reduces inner tension tied to disowned material, the shadow, as Jung described, so the person keeps doing it despite the costs. This dovetails with Jung's observations of narrowed consciousness and automatic actions. The person feels driven, not free. The lying happens because not lying feels unbearable or unnatural. Observers often report greater danger and distress when interacting with liars, more so than the individuals with pathological lying would report about themselves. This mismatch reinforces the idea that pathological lying isn't simply strategic. It's self-protective and self-blinding, with consequences that spill into relationships and safety. The person is caught in a pattern they struggle to control, even when they intellectually understand the damage. Jung cautioned about what he called partial responsibility. A willful beginning can slide into autosuggestion, a pathological process the person struggles to stop. That nuance helps clinicians and loved ones respond to pathological lying as both accountable and compulsive. It guides care that balances boundaries with strategies to reduce urges and build tolerance for truth. But the deeper question remains: what happens to the self when the lies take over completely? Jung documented cases where people lost contact with their authentic self and built fictional personas that required constant maintenance. Under pressure, the fabricated identity fails to work. Relationships explode, daily functioning breaks down. The person is living inside a story that can't survive contact with the real world. He described double consciousness and somnambulistic states where an alternative personality chain takes over, complete with its own memories, motives, and roles. During these episodes, performance feels real. The false self is convincing to the speaker and confusing to listeners. The person isn't pretending. They've dissociated into a narrative that runs on its own programming. Jung showed that deliberate role-play can become overpowering autosuggestion. The person no longer merely acts. The act acts on them, tightening the grip of the invented persona. Amnesia, altered perception, and narrowed attention usually follow. The gap between the working ego and the story-producing system widens, fragmenting identity and keeping the false self alive. Many of the complex narratives Jung observed were state-dependent. They emerged only during attacks or twilight states and could not be generated in ordinary waking thought. The uneven distribution of memory and creativity across states undermines continuity of self. You end up with a person who is multiple selves depending on context, none of them fully integrated, none of them stable. Under intense emotion and narrowed attention, behavior becomes automatic and compulsive. Actions feel less voluntary, even though they have real-world consequences. That loss of flexible control widens the gap between persona and authentic functioning. The person is no longer steering their own life. The story is steering them. Jung argued for nuanced accountability. A willful beginning can shift into a pathological process that the person struggles to stop. This view supports approaches that restore reality testing, broaden attention, and reintegrate disowned material rather than relying on blame alone. The goal isn't to shame someone for their false self. The goal is to help them reconnect with a workable, reality-based truth. Over time, the false self of a liar collapses under real-life demands. Trust erodes, stories conflict, isolation grows. The persona that once felt protective becomes a prison. The path back involves reconnecting with truth, because only truth allows stable relationships and coherent identity. So where do you go from here? If you've been on the receiving end of pathological lying, or if you recognize these patterns in yourself, the way forward isn't about willpower or moral condemnation. It's about creating space for truth to breathe again. Start with one practice, the shadow truth exercise. Here's how it works. Step 1. Identify the emotional state that precedes the impulse to lie. It's usually shame, fear, or inadequacy. The story rises up to protect you from feeling something unbearable. Name the feeling without judgment. Step 2. Ask yourself, what shadow aspect am I trying to hide? What truth about myself am I avoiding? Maybe it's the belief that you're not enough. Maybe it's anger you were never allowed to express. Maybe it's the fear that if people saw the real you, they'd leave. Step 3. Practice authentic truth-telling in one small daily situation. Accept the discomfort. It will feel raw. It might feel like failure. But that discomfort is the boundary where the self ends and the real one begins. You didn't choose to develop these patterns. Many of them formed when you were young and couldn't protect yourself any other way. The lying wasn't moral failure. It was biological survival. But now you get to choose differently. Carl Jung once observed that the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, because no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. Recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real takes courage. But that recognition is also the doorway to freedom. You're not broken. Your brain has learned a set of behaviors, and behaviors can be changed when you finally feel safe enough to tell the truth. That may require a little discomfort, but I'm confident you can handle it. As a wise man once said, "The path to heaven lies through hell." Thank you for joining me on this exploration into the psychology of a pathological liar. If this resonated, please share your reflections in the comments below and subscribe for more journeys into the depths of practical psychology, philosophy, and personal development. Until next time.